This Pioneer SX-525 has a few features and a few foibles that I found really interesting. So today, what we're going to do is take a look at everything that it does, and I'm going to talk a little about speaker efficiency and what that means with respect to vintage amplifiers like this. And look, you made it through the last video, so clearly you like stuff like this. So this should be right up your alley. Let's jump in. I'm coming to you today in Star Trek The Original Series lighting. I just thought it would be fun. This is a Pioneer SX-525 stereo receiver. Receiver because it has a built-in tuner and multiple inputs for peripherals. We'll eventually talk about the difference between power amplifiers and integrated amplifiers when I actually run across a working example of each, but today's not that day. As we discussed in the last video, it has a rating of 13 watts per channel. That doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not by modern amp standards. But as many people in forums have pointed out, when you pair it with efficient speakers, you can actually get a lot of sound out of it. Now, that entire sentence, while it may sound very earnest, is actually kind of meaningless if you don't understand what it means to have efficient speakers. Speaker efficiency is not a metric of how good the speaker is. In fact, it actually has very little to do with the sound quality, at least not directly. Speaker efficiency is simply a measure of how much audible sound can be produced with a given power output from the amplifier. And the reason that changes from speaker to speaker is because the engineers are forced to trade efficiency for complexity. That's why modern speakers, which are highly tuned to make very precise frequency response and full sound, regardless of their size, are considered less efficient. Every component an engineer adds to either the drivers or internal crossover network in the pursuit of a clean, perfect sound converts a small amount of the signal power into heat instead of audible volume. That's just physics, and there's no real way around that. With heavier composite cones, dampened cabinets, and especially stiffer, more controlled suspensions, modern speakers aim to produce as perfect a reproduction of the original signal as possible, but they do it at the cost of needing more power to drive them. That's why a lot of modern amplifiers and receivers have a much higher power output. Units like this SX-525 with their comparably low power output are going to struggle to get the same volume out of a modern set of speakers. They simply weren't designed for it. However, since speakers from this era would have run very basic internal setups and much lighter, more flexible drivers, they're still able to get a very big, very powerful sound out of something like this. The difference is, instead of being highly tuned to a nearly perfect frequency response, the mechanical and budgetary restrictions would color the sound of whatever you're listening to, since what you're hearing is no longer a faithful reproduction of the original signal. Now, you may argue that older vintage equipment like this is inferior because the point of a stereo system, especially a full-sized one like this, is to be as accurate as possible. That's the audiophile perspective, and I'll concede that's a fair viewpoint. But there are many people out there, myself included, that find the subtle coloration of the audio signal part of the fun of using this old equipment. Each piece really does sound different, and it allows you to mix and match your components to more or less season your listening experience to your taste. Plus, it's fun to just get to try different equipment and see what it sounds like. It's kind of like going to Baskin-Robbins. So where does that leave our little SX-525? Well, it's definitely something that you're going to need to pair with efficient speakers. And efficient often means vintage. There's no getting around that. It's not going to blow your windows out with a modern set of high-end speakers. But then again, if you can afford those modern speakers, you're probably not relying on a $20 Pioneer receiver from an estate sale like this anyway, so the whole thing is kind of moot. That said, let's take a look at this thing. It's got the beautiful brushed aluminum finish done in Pioneer's champagne color, which I love. Your power switch is on the left side. When you power it up, you're treated to the classic blue tuner dial that was iconic from this era. Weird, since everything else in the 70s is orange, brown, and harvest gold. Much like my living room. You're able to select between two banks of speakers, A, B, A and B together, or neither. So this could drive 4 total speakers at once if you wanted. Not bad for being near the bottom of Pioneer's lineup at the time. Turning the speakers off, as you've probably guessed, was so the signal would only output through the headphone jack. That only affects the speaker output though, which I'll touch on for a second later. The machine instantly turns on. There's no protection relay. We know that for 2 reasons. Number 1, I've had this thing pulled apart and didn't see one, but also because there's no click. You may have noticed on a lot of amps and receivers that there's a short pause after you turn them on, followed by an audible click. Then it starts making sound. That is something called a protection relay. Now, as the name suggests, that's a simple electromechanical protection device. When you first power on a piece of equipment like this, it takes time for everything to stabilize, especially in top-of-the-line units like the SX-1980, which would have contained a massive power supply and weighed as much as a Volvo. As the machine stabilizes, you can get little, or sometimes not so little, voltage spikes, noises, and so on that could potentially get dumped straight into the speakers. The relay waits until everything is stable to click on and engage the speakers. That relay is notably absent here. When I power it up, the speakers do pop a little bit. That noise is literally the sound of the circuit stabilizing. I'll be honest, this is something I do specifically point to as a drawback. You know me, I don't like to criticize things if I can help it, but there's nothing about a protection relay, or lack thereof, that colors the sound of an amplifier. It's a safety device, and not having one, especially when other contemporary units of the same lineup had them, it's not ideal. However, in this thing's defense, it's a very low power unit, and so there's not a ton of power to protect things from in the first place. So, fair enough. The bass and treble knobs are on a scale of minimum to flat to maximum, separated by 11 detent positions on the potentiometer. I find that particularly interesting because the balance knob is a smooth gradient. The detents on the other knobs aren't switches though, they're just clicks. If you jimmy the pointer between two of the clicks, you can hear that it is in fact a smooth gradient between each position. Not sure why they did that, but I will say the clicks are very smooth and they make a nice sound. The volume control is a smooth gradient as well, just like the balance control. You've got your loudness function, which we've talked about many times on the channel already, so I won't bore you with what that does. Then you've got FM muting, which basically turns off the sound output for any FM radio signal below a certain strength, so you're not just blasted with static while you're tuning your radio. In this case, the threshold seems to be anything over 1.5. And on the right, you can switch between stereo and monaural. There are 2 tape monitors, meaning you've got the ability to hook up 2 different tape decks at the same time for dubbing tapes. Here's where things start to get a little interesting, because you've got a few different quirks here. Let's flip it around to the back, because this amp, according to this impossible to read yellow sticker, is ready for 4-channel. Not 4chan, we don't talk about that. Now, don't get too excited, this isn't a 4-channel quad receiver. If it was, believe me, Pioneer would have plastered quad badges all over every free inch of space on the front, which they didn't. What that actually refers to is simply that a quadraphonic signal could pass through it without interference. Quad signals weren't usually 4 discrete audio channels. Many were a 4-channel signal that was encoded and recorded as a stereo signal, then decoded back into 4 channels by dedicated decoding hardware. Encoding 2 channels into 1 is something we've been doing for years with stereo FM signals after all. At the time, a lot of quad setups had dedicated decoders that you would buy, but Pioneer's marketing department, who we've already established in the last video, can absolutely be trusted at their word in 1972, were concerned that stereo equipment like this may be seen as obsolete, so they made every attempt at extolling the compatibility of their stereo equipment with the impending next wave that was quadraphonic sound, which will be any day now. If we venture back to the face of this thing, on the far right is your input selector switch. It has AM, 3 flavors of FM, a phono/microphone input, and an auxiliary input. The auxiliary input is a standard line level, so you can hook up anything from a separate radio tuner to an 8-track to even a CD player or modern Bluetooth dongle. The internal phono preamp is expecting a moving magnet style cartridge, and the phono input is disabled when the microphone is inserted, so both cannot be used simultaneously. AM is AM. I don't think that needs any explanation. The FM though, it's got some options. You have mono, which is either monaural or Salty Lake in California. You have auto, which will automatically engage the stereo decoder if the signal is strong enough. And finally, the noise filter, which is basically a high frequency roll-off. It filters out the highs where a lot of the hiss lives. And if the 19 kilohertz pilot signal that triggers the stereo multiplex decoder isn't perfectly removed, it also compensates for artifacts from that. My favorite thing about this unit is the tuner dial. The white backlight filtering through blue acrylic really looks nice in person. It's on all the time, but what's really neat is the signal meter and the dial indicator both light up when the radio functions are engaged. That glowing dial indicator is such a treat. The only other unit that I've ever had that did that was the Realistic STA-77. And I love that they used all blue for the radio and green for the phono and aux indicators. Stereo is, of course, bright red. So let's look at the back. Before I show all the greeblies, I have to point this badge out. 95 watts. That's a bit exaggerated, so much so in fact that it warranted a whole previous video about exactly that, hence why this is part 2. Now, you have your bank of RCA inputs and outputs, as well as one of my favorite things to see, a 5-pin DIN connector for the tape 1 monitor. So you can use either a DIN cable or 2 pairs of stereo RCA cables. Tape 2 only uses RCA cables. And turning the speakers off on the front does not affect or disable the signal going to the tape decks. The speaker outputs use Pioneer's notorious adapter plugs, which are frustratingly difficult to source original versions of. I use these off-brand ones that I found on Amazon, which were too wide originally and needed to be filed narrower because I feel weird returning things. There are nonetheless lots of them on eBay and Amazon if you're willing to pay $15 to $30 for a pitiful piece of plastic with some plug prongs and some alliteration. But at least they're available and they do work. Next to the speaker outputs are a pair of fuses. I know I said there's no protection relay. They did at least include this pair of fuses to protect the speakers from severe overcurrent and short circuits, which I do appreciate. These are separate from the main fuse for the receiver itself. If it doesn't power on, check this 2 amp fuse. However, keep in mind the fuse blew for a reason, so if you do have to change it, don't be surprised if there's something else wrong. But so far, I've never encountered a blown fuse. You've got a pair of power outlets for peripherals like a tape deck or possibly another tape deck, or a lamp, whichever you prefer. The left one is switched on and off by the power switch, and the other one is on all the time. Above those, you have your antenna inputs. The receiver can pick up signals without an antenna, but not very well. It needs an antenna. The 75 ohm unbalanced input is where a stripped coaxial cable would hook up. The clamp is grounded and hooks to the outer shielding, and the screw hooks to the central conductor. The 300 ohm inputs are for balanced antennas like those T-shaped dipole antennas or the ridiculous one I have attached to the outside of my house that picks up signals from Isengard. The ground and AM hookups are where you'd attach an AM loop like this if the little ferrite bar in the back is inadequate. They also put a lot of warnings and labels on the back of this unit. I got some high-resolution photos of them so you can read them if you want, if that's your thing. I'll also say that I appreciate that this has taller feet. It may seem silly, but receivers and amplifiers are heavy, and it's nice to be able to get my fingers underneath to pick it up, especially when it's on a carpeted floor. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, or at least you learned something. I feel like this is a lot more fun as a hobby if we're able to be inclusive about it. So I'd like to at least try to make each one of these sort of helpful for anybody who's just starting out on their vintage stereo journey. Also, I'd like to make a trade. I'm a huge metal guy, as I'm sure you guys are well aware of at this point. I'd like to recommend an album to everyone, and I'd love to have you guys suggest some of your favorite metal albums in the comments. I need new stuff to listen to. So my recommendation for this video is a power metal album from 2001, which I have referenced before. Luca Turilli's Prophet of the Last Eclipse. I love it. It's a concept album that tells a story, so on a first listen, I'd suggest hearing it once through in its entirety to get the whole story. But yeah, I'll see you guys soon. I'm writing a screenplay, so wish me luck there. And I'll see you guys again in the next one. Take care.